The first snow fell on Cornelius Redmond, the morning Lenora Langston pressed the barrel of her late husband's revolver directly against his chest, and told him she would pull the trigger if he did not tell her the truth about why he was still in Caldwell Creek. He did not flinch. He stood there in the doorway of her boarding house, his long duster coat dusted white at the shoulders, his dark eyes steady and unreadable as the frozen sky behind him, and he said very quietly, "Put the gun down, Lenora." "Answer me first," she said. Her voice did not waver, though her hands were shaking, though the winter light coming through the open door was cold enough to make her breath visible in small, desperate clouds. "You told me you were passing through. You told me that in September. It is now November. The snow is falling. You are still here. And last night I found your name in my husband's ledger." Something moved behind his eyes then. Something dark and complicated and afraid, which was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen on the face of a man like Cornelius Redmond, because a man who had ridden half the frontier with a reputation that made sheriffs step aside and outlaws reconsider their choices was not supposed to look afraid of anything. "Which ledger?" he said. "The one he hid beneath the floorboards," she said. "The one I was never meant to find. The one with your name written next to a sum of money and the word betrayal." The snow fell between them, soft and indifferent. He reached up very slowly and placed his hand over hers on the gun, not to take it from her, not to fight her. Just to hold it there, his warm fingers over her cold ones, his eyes never leaving her face. "There are things I need to explain to you," he said, "and none of them are going to be easy to hear, but not out here, not in the cold. Let me come inside, Lenora. Let me tell you everything." She searched his face for another long moment, looking for the lie, looking for the trap, looking for the hidden motive she had been so certain she would find there. She stepped back and led him through the door. That had been 2 months coming, and the story of how they arrived at that moment was one that neither of them had planned, neither of them had wanted, and neither of them would have traded for anything in the world by the time it was finally, mercifully, honestly told. Cornelius Redmond had ridden into Caldwell Creek, Kansas, on a Thursday afternoon in the last week of September, in the year 1882, with the specific and unromantic intention of riding straight out the other side. He had been traveling south, down through the territories, following a job that had since dissolved into nothing, the way jobs in his line of work tended to do when the men who offered them were apprehended by federal marshals before the work could be completed. He was not a lawman, and he was not precisely an outlaw, though he had drifted close enough to both edges to understand the territory between them intimately. He was what the frontier produced in men who were too smart for honest labor, too principled for crime, and too stubborn to settle into either category permanently. He was a hired gun with a selective conscience, and he was tired in a way that had very little to do with the distance he had ridden. He had stopped at Caldwell Creek because his horse needed water, because he himself needed a meal that did not involve hardtack and cold coffee, and because the town had appeared on the horizon at precisely the right moment of late afternoon light to look briefly, deceptively like somewhere a person might want to be. It was a small town, the way most Kansas towns were small in those years, still finding their shape in the flat expanse of the prairie. There was a main street with a general store, a telegraph office, a saloon called the Amber Rose that had seen better decades, and a church with a bell that was missing its clapper and had been that way for 3 years according to the sign someone had posted on the door explaining the situation with evident weariness. There was a mill operating sluggishly at the edge of town, by the creek it was named for, and there was a boarding house set back slightly from the main street, distinguished by its green-painted shutters, and the kitchen garden still holding the last of the autumn's herbs along its front fence. It was the boarding house where Cornelius ate his meal, because the woman who ran it offered dinner to travelers at a rate that included bread and coffee, and whatever the season provided from her garden, and because the alternative was the Amber Rose Saloon, where the food was secondary to the whiskey and the company was secondary to the card games. He had not expected Lenora Langston. That was the simple truth of it, and it was the thing he would come back to again and again in the weeks that followed. The way a man runs his tongue over a sore tooth, not because it feels good, but because he cannot seem to stop. He had not expected her. She came out of the kitchen carrying a cast iron pot with the practiced ease of a woman who had been running a household since she was old enough to reach the stove, and she was nothing like the women men wrote poems about. She was practical. Her dark hair was coiled back from her face in a knot that was beginning to escape its pins after a long day's work. Her dress was brown wool with a white collar, and she had a burned scar on the inside of her right wrist from a cooking accident long past. She was perhaps 28, perhaps 30, with the kind of face that became more interesting the longer you looked at it, and eyes that were a complicated shade of gray that changed with the light and with whatever she was thinking. She set the pot on the table, looked at him with the measured assessment of a woman who had learned to read strangers quickly and trust them slowly, and said, "You will be wanting the room or just the meal?" "Just the meal," he said. "I am riding out tonight." She nodded and went back to the kitchen, and he ate his meal, which was a beef stew with carrots and onions, and something herbal he could not identify, but that tasted like warmth itself. And he drank his coffee, and he thought about the road south and the nothing in particular waiting for him there. He was still sitting at the table when she came back to clear the dishes, and she paused when she saw him still there, and she looked at the window where the afternoon had turned into early evening, and the evening was turning into something darker and faster than expected. "There is a storm coming in from the north," she said. "Not unusual for this time of year. The road south is bad in rain. The creek floods the lower crossing." He looked at the window, he looked at his coffee cup, he looked at her. "How much for the room?" he asked. 25 cents a night," she said. "Includes breakfast." He was still there the next morning. The storm had been genuine, a cold, driving Kansas rain that turned the road to mud and the creek to a rushing brown problem. And in the morning the sunlight was watery and thin, and Lenora Langston made him eggs and biscuits and coffee without comment, and he meant to leave as soon as the road dried. The road took 2 days to dry. In those 2 days, he learned her name, because she introduced herself when he paid for the second night. He learned that she was a widow, because there was a photograph on the mantelpiece of a man with careful eyes and a thin mouth, and because the town called her Mrs. Langston, with a particular weight of condolence still attached to it after 2 years of use. He learned that she had come to Caldwell Creek 8 years ago as the new wife of Edmund Langston, who had run the mill, and that Edmund Langston had died 2 years past of a fever that had swept through the town in the summer of 1880, taking 4 people with it before it spent itself. He learned these things in the way travelers learn things in boarding houses, in pieces, from the landlady herself, from the other guests, from the rhythm of the household and the small evidence of lives lived in spaces. He was a man who had learned to gather information the way some people gathered coins, automatically and without entirely meaning to. What he did not learn in those 2 days was how to stop thinking about her gray eyes and the way she laughed when the elderly minister from the church stopped in for his weekly coffee and said something she found genuinely funny, a real laugh that came from somewhere unguarded and surprised him, because it was so completely unself-conscious. He left when the road dried. He rode south for 4 miles, and the prairie opened up around him in every direction, flat and enormous and entirely empty of anything that resembled what he had just left behind, and he sat on his horse in the middle of that vast Kansas quiet, and had a conversation with himself that he was not proud of, being a man who prided himself on decisiveness. Then he turned his horse around. He told himself it was practical. He told himself the job opportunities further south were uncertain, that the winter was coming in earlier than usual, that a man of his particular skills and history would be well advised to stay in one place for a month or 2, and let certain people who were looking for him in certain directions run out of patience and move on. All of these things were true. None of them were the reason he turned his horse around. He came back to the boarding house and knocked on the green-shuttered door, and Lenora Langston opened it with flour on her hands and looked at him with those gray eyes that were currently more complicated than usual, like weather changing, like a sky deciding what to do. "I thought you were leaving," she said. "I changed my mind," he said. "If the room is still available." A pause, something moving across her face that was careful and quick and impossible to name accurately. "It is available," she said, and stepped back to let him in. He paid for a week. He told himself he would leave after the week. He did not leave after the week. He paid for another week. He was not entirely sure when he stopped telling himself he was leaving and started simply living there. The way a man stops swimming upstream and lets the current have him, not because he has surrendered, but because he has decided to trust the river. Caldwell Creek had a population of 231 people, which meant that a stranger who stayed longer than 3 days became, by default, a subject of intense communal interest. Cornelius Redmond was a more interesting subject than most, being a man who wore his gun low and kept his past clothes, and had the kind of physical presence that made rooms feel smaller when he entered them, not because he was threatening, but because he was simply very much there in a way that some people are and most are not. The town had opinions about him. Most of them were offered to Lenora directly. Martha Dewhurst, who ran the general store with her husband and had opinions about everything as a kind of civic duty, stopped Lenora on the second Monday of Cornelius's extended stay and said, with the transparent concern of a woman who meant well and was going to say exactly what she thought regardless, "That man staying with you, Mrs. Langston. He has the look of trouble." "Most men do," Lenora said, and selected her coffee beans with attention and was not further drawn out on the subject. The Reverend Horace Cully, who came for his weekly coffee and was genuinely kind and genuinely nosy in equal measure, asked Cornelius one morning, with the directness of a man who felt his profession gave him certain licenses, "What is it you do for a living, Mr. Redmond?" "Currently I am resting," Cornelius said, which was the truest and most evasive answer he could manage. The Reverend nodded as if this were a complete and satisfying response, which either meant he was more perceptive than he appeared or less, and Cornelius was not certain which. What the town did not know, and what Cornelius had been carrying in his chest since the moment he saw her name on the boarding house sign, was that the name Langston was not entirely new to him. He had known an Edmund Langston, not well, not personally, but by reputation and by a specific, unresolved piece of business that had been sitting in the back of his mind for 2 years, since the summer Edmund Langston had died of a fever in Caldwell Creek, Kansas, leaving certain matters unfinished between them. Edmund Langston had not only run the mill. Edmund Langston had, for a period of approximately 3 years before his death, been involved in a financial arrangement with a man named Silas Crow, who was the kind of man whose financial arrangements were never simple and never clean. Silas Crow had recruited Edmund Langston to provide cover for certain activities involving the movement of stolen goods through the mill, using the legitimate business of grain and timber as a screen for things that were neither grain nor timber. And Silas Crow had, at various points in this arrangement, also employed Cornelius Redmond to handle what Crow called enforcement situations, which was a phrase Crow used instead of the more accurate phrase that Cornelius had declined to use when he eventually declined to work for Crow any further. The connection between Cornelius and Edmund Langston was therefore indirect, but it was real, and it was documented, because Crow was a meticulous man who kept records of everyone he dealt with, and one of those records had been a ledger that listed payments and transactions and the names of everyone involved, and that ledger had, after Crow's own arrest and imprisonment in 1881, passed through several hands and was now, according to Cornelius's best information, somewhere in Caldwell Creek. He had come to Caldwell Creek to find that ledger. Specifically, to find it before the federal agents who were still unraveling Crow's operations found it, because his own name was in it. And his own name being in it was a problem that could translate into years of his life, spent in circumstances he did not prefer. He had not expected to find that Edmund Langston was dead, that his widow ran a boarding house, and that the ledger, if it existed in this town at all, was very likely still somewhere in the property that Edmund Langston had left behind. He had not expected Lenora. That was the thing that kept complicating the plan. The plan had been simple: find the ledger, remove himself from it, or remove it from circulation, leave. The plan had not accounted for the fact that Lenora Langston was a woman who made excellent stew and had a real laugh and argued with the Reverend Cully about Scripture with complete confidence, and who had, over the course of October, begun to look at Cornelius in a way that did something uncategorizable to his internal landscape. The looking had started slowly. She was not a woman who rushed anything. She watched people the way she tended her kitchen garden, with patient attention and the willingness to wait for clarity. She watched him pour the milk for the elderly cat that had come with the boarding house and stayed past its expected lifespan through sheer determination. She watched him carry wood for her when the woodpile needed restocking without being asked. She watched him sit at the kitchen table in the evenings sometimes, after the other guests had retired, working in a small notebook that he closed when anyone came near, but that he always brought out again after, because he was working on something he could not seem to stop working on. She watched him, and she noticed things, and she did not ask questions she did not think she would be answered, which was a form of intelligence that he recognized and respected. What she did ask him on the first Friday of October, when they were the only two people in the kitchen after supper, and the wind was beginning to smell like the approaching autumn end, was, "Do you ever want to stop?" He looked up from his notebook. "Stop what?" "Whatever it is you do," she said. "Whatever it is that makes you look like that when you think no one is watching." He was quiet for a moment, in the particular way that meant he was deciding something rather than calculating it. "Yes," he said, "I think about it." She nodded and refilled his coffee and asked nothing else, and the conversation sat between them in the warm kitchen air like something neither of them was quite ready to pick up yet. October moved through the way Kansas Octobers do, in long golden days and nights that got colder faster than expected, and the boarding house held 3 other guests through the month. A surveyor named Hooper, who was mapping a potential railroad route and was gone after 2 weeks, a young schoolteacher named Miss Aileen Park, who had just come out from Ohio to take the position the town had been advertising for a year, and an older woman named Mrs. Beaumont, who was traveling to visit her daughter in Wichita and had been delayed by a combination of a lame horse and a very persistent cold. Cornelius existed alongside these people with the practiced ease of a man who had lived out of other people's spaces for most of his adult life, which was 15 years of adult life, because he was 33 years old and had been on his own since he was 18, which was the year his family's farm in Missouri had gone under, and his father had gone with it into a grief he never climbed back out of, and his mother had gone to live with her sister in St. Louis, and Cornelius had gone west because west was the direction the country kept insisting on. He had not had a home since then. He had rooms, he had places he passed through, he had work and roads and the particular freedoms and particular loneliness of a life lived without permanent attachment. He was, at 33, accustomed to this. He had made his peace with it the way a person makes peace with a scar, by acknowledging it and not looking at it too directly. The boarding house of Lenora Langston was doing something to that peace that he could not articulate cleanly, and he was a man who could articulate most things if he tried hard enough. It had something to do with the consistency of it. The meals were always ready when they were said to be ready. The fire in the parlor was always lit by evening. The sheets on his bed were clean, and the window in his room faced east so the morning light came through it early and warm, and he had not slept in a bed with clean sheets and morning light for long enough that the experience of it was doing something strange and persistent to him. It had more to do with her. He noticed things about her the way he noticed things about landscapes, instinctively and in detail. He noticed that she hummed when she was concentrating on something that required precision. He noticed that she kept a small volume of poems on the shelf in the parlor that had been read and reread enough that its spine was cracked in 3 places. He noticed that she was strict about money, not miserly but careful, the way people who have learned what it is to manage alone are careful, not from fear but from understanding. He noticed that she had a habit, when something pleased her unexpectedly, of pressing her lips together quickly, as if she was trying to contain the smile before she could decide whether it was appropriate. He noticed, one afternoon when he came in from the street and she was sitting in the kitchen reading a letter, that she had been crying and that she had stopped quickly when she heard his footsteps, and that she had folded the letter and placed it in her apron pocket with the particular deliberateness of a woman who was very practiced at being all right. He did not ask about it. He sat down at the table and pulled out his notebook, and she made tea without being asked, and set a cup in front of him, and sat back down across from him, and they were quiet together for a while, and it was the most comfortable Cornelius Redmond had been in 15 years. That evening he searched for the ledger. He was not proud of it. He waited until she had gone to bed and the house was quiet, and he moved through it with the quiet efficiency of a man who knew how to move through spaces without disturbing them, checking the places where a careful man like Edmund Langston might have hidden something he needed kept safe. He checked the study, which had been Edmund's, and which Lenora had converted to a storage room but had not gone through entirely, the way people who have lost someone sometimes cannot bring themselves to go through things entirely. He checked the loose board in the hallway that he had noticed gave slightly differently than the others when walked over. He found, behind a false back panel in the study wardrobe, a tin box. The tin box contained letters, a deed to the mill that had since been sold, a small amount of paper money, and a ledger. He took the ledger out and opened it and found exactly what he had feared to find, and also something worse. His name was there, listed under enforcement payments for 3 specific dates in 1879 and 1880. That was what he had expected. What he had not expected was that the ledger also contained, in Edmund Langston's cramped and precise handwriting, a separate section near the back, titled with the word documentation, which was a careful summary of everything Edmund Langston had known about Silas Crow's operations, including the names of everyone involved, and which appeared to have been compiled by Edmund Langston as a kind of insurance policy against Crow, or perhaps as something he intended to turn over to the law, or perhaps as something he had never decided what to do with and had simply kept. Cornelius sat on the floor of the study in the dark with the ledger and understood, with a clarity that was deeply uncomfortable, that Edmund Langston had been a more complicated man than the photograph on the mantelpiece suggested. A man who had gotten himself into something he could not get out of cleanly, and who had documented everything perhaps because he wanted a way out, or perhaps because he had wanted someone someday to understand what had happened. He sat with this for a long time. Then he put the ledger back in the tin box and put the tin box back behind the panel in the wardrobe, and went to his room and did not sleep until nearly morning. The question of what to do with the ledger was not simple, and he knew it was not simple, and he spent the next several days being more than usually quiet while he worked it out. The federal agents who were still unraveling Crow's operations were not actively in Caldwell Creek yet, but they would be, eventually. They were methodical and they were patient, and they were working through the list of people and places connected to Crow's network with a thoroughness that would eventually bring them here. If they found the ledger, his name in it would require explaining, and the explanation, while truthful, was the kind of truth that juries in 1882 did not always find satisfying. He had not committed the crimes Crow had been convicted of, but he had been on Crow's payroll, and his name was in the record, and that was a rope that could be pulled in uncomfortable directions. If he took the ledger and destroyed it, he protected himself. He also destroyed the documentation section, which represented Edmund Langston's meticulous record of real crimes committed by real people, and which might matter to the people those crimes had been committed against. And if he told Lenora what he knew about her dead husband's involvement with Sela's Crow, he would be handing her a version of her own life story that she had not been given and might not want, and could not unlearn once it was given. He was caught. He was caught by his own hidden motive, and by the fact that his hidden motive was slowly being overtaken by something he did not have a clean name for, something that had been building since the first evening in the kitchen and had been compounding daily since, something that was making the idea of simply taking what he needed and leaving feel less like an option and more like a violence. October became the first days of November, and the cold came in from the north and settled over the prairie with the particular inevitability of a Kansas winter establishing its territory, and Cornelius Redmond was still in Caldwell Creek. Two things happened in the first week of November that changed the shape of everything. The first was that two men arrived in town. They had the look of traveling businessmen, unremarkable coats and unremarkable horses and an unremarkable manner. But Cornelius recognized one of them from 3 years back, a man named Forsyth who worked for the network of federal investigators that had brought Crow down, and the recognition sat in Cornelius's chest like a stone dropping through cold water. They checked into the Amber Rose because the boarding house was full, Miss Park and Mrs. Beaumont both still in residence, and they began to ask quiet questions about Edmund Langston and the mill and the town's history with a thoroughness that confirmed exactly what Cornelius had been dreading. The second thing was Lenora. She had been moving, through October, in and out of the edge of something that Cornelius could feel but could not name, the way you can feel a storm on the air before the sky gives any indication. She had been warmer and then more reserved and then warmer again, and he had been reading it and misreading it in equal measure. And then, on the 5th of November, she made him an apple cake. She brought it to the table after supper when the other guests had gone up, set it between them with 2 plates, and sat down and cut him a slice. And this was such a simple act, such a domestic and ordinary act, and she did it with a kind of deliberateness that made it feel like something else, like a door being opened. And he looked at her across the table, and she was looking back at him with those gray eyes that were saying something complex and unguarded and decided. And he felt the ground shift beneath him in a way that had nothing to do with the prairie. "Why are you still here, Cornelius?" she asked. It was the first time she had used his first name. He could have given her the evasive answer. He was very good at evasive answers. Instead he said, "I am trying to work something out, something in that notebook. Something more complicated than the notebook." She ate a bite of cake. She was quiet for a moment in the way that meant she was deciding rather than hesitating. "I have been trying to work something out as well," she said. "Since a few weeks ago, since I noticed you watching the men at the Amber Rose." He stilled. "The 2 new men," she said. "You know them?" "One of them," he said. "Are they dangerous?" she asked, direct, calm, no performance. "To me, possibly," he said. "To you, no." She considered this with the gravity she brought to most things. "Then you had better tell me," she said, "what it is you are actually doing here, because I am not a woman who finds secrets charming, and I think you have enough of them to fill a barn." He looked at her. He looked at the apple cake between them, which was still warm. He thought about the ledger behind the panel in the wardrobe in the study he had not told her he had searched. "It is complicated," he said. "I am not easily confused," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. "It involves your husband," he said. The change in her face was subtle and significant, the way a sky changes before weather arrives, everything tightening slightly and then going very still. "Tell me," she said. He did. Not all of it, not that night, but the shape of it. He told her that Edmund had been involved with a man named Sela's Crow. He told her that Crow's network was being investigated by federal agents and that those agents were now in Caldwell Creek. He told her that Edmond had kept a ledger documenting the activities. He did not tell her yet that he had found the ledger, or that his own name was in it, because he had not yet decided what the right thing to do with that information was, and because her face, as he spoke, had gone through something that he did not want to add to carelessly. She sat with what he told her for a long time after he finished speaking. Edmond knew about this, she asked. Not what she had expected, he suspected, not how she had expected it said, the quiet flatness in her voice, the sound of a woman receiving information that rearranges many things at once. He did, Cornelius said. I believe, from what I know of the situation, that he was not entirely willing. Crow was a man who made it difficult to say no once he had decided you were useful to him. Lenora looked at the photograph on the mantelpiece for a moment. Then she looked back at Cornelius. Did you work for this man, Crow? There it was. The question he had known was coming and had not successfully prepared for. Yes, he said. I did. Not for long and not for the same things Edmond was used for, but yes. The silence that followed was the longest and most complicated silence Cornelius had experienced in a very long time. Are you here because of the ledger? She said, precise, steady. He looked at her. He owed her the truth. He had been owing her the truth for 6 weeks and had been finding reasons to delay it. And sitting across from her in the lamplight with the apple cake cooling between them and the sound of November wind against the shutters, he was done with the delay. Yes, he said. That was why I came. I came to find it before the federal agents did because my name is in it. She absorbed this. He watched her absorb it, the small, tight breath, the hands that had been still on the table now folding together carefully. And were you going to take it and leave? She said. That had been the plan, he said. What changed the plan? He looked at her steadily. He did not look away. You know what changed it, he said. She held his gaze for a very long time. Then she stood up and took both their cake plates and went into the kitchen, and he heard water being poured and dishes being set down, and then quiet. He sat at the table for a while and then he went to his room, and he lay in the east-facing room with the clean sheets and the morning light that was not morning yet, and he thought about what he had said and what it meant and what he intended to do about it. In the morning she was in the kitchen when he came down and breakfast was on the table, and she looked at him when he came in and said, "Show me where it is." He showed her. He led her to the study and opened the wardrobe and retrieved the tin box and gave it to her, because it was hers, because it had always been hers, because it had belonged to the man who had been her husband, even if that man had been a more complicated person than either of them had fully known. She sat down on the floor of the study in the gray morning light and opened the tin box and opened the ledger. She read it the way she read everything, carefully and completely, not rushing and not flinching. He sat down across from her, his back against the opposite wall, and waited. She read for a long time. He watched her face move through things he could not entirely follow, but could respect the weight of. Edmond Langston's crimes, small and large, and documented in Edmond Langston's own precise hand. Edmond Langston's apparent crisis of conscience, visible in the documentation section that read like a man trying to create a record that would outlast his own complicated choices. Edmond Langston's death at 34 of a fever, leaving his wife with a boarding house and a tin box, and a life she had not entirely been given the context for. When she finished, she closed the ledger and held it in her lap and looked at the middle distance for a while. He was trying to get out, she said. The documentation, he was building a case, he was going to go to the law. That is how it reads to me, Cornelius said. He never told me any of it, she said, not a word. He may have been protecting you, Cornelius said, or he may have been ashamed, probably both. She looked down at the ledger, then she looked up at Cornelius. Your name, she said. Yes. You were trying to protect yourself, she said. Yes. And now? He did not answer immediately. He thought about it honestly, the way he had been thinking about it for 6 weeks, the way he had been thinking about it more clearly in the last 24 hours than he had managed to be about anything in recent memory. Now I think the right thing to do is to give it to the agents, he said. The documentation section specifically. Whatever happens to my name in the other section is something I will have to address directly." She looked at him for a very long time. "That could mean serious trouble for you," she said. "Yes," he said, "it could. And you are willing to do that." He met her gaze. "I am willing to do that." Another long moment between them, and then she looked down at the ledger again and then back up at him, and her gray eyes were doing something he had never quite seen them do, which was something open and certain and decided, like a sky after weather has passed. "Then we will do it together," she said. "We will go to those men together and we will give them what Edmund meant to give them, and whatever comes of your name in their record, we will address it together." He was quiet for a moment with what she had just said, the word together, which was the most extraordinary word he had heard anyone apply to his situation in 15 years. "You do not owe me that," he said. "I know I do not owe it," she said. "That is not why I am saying it." She stood up from the floor, still holding the ledger, and looked at him with the composed directness that was one of the central facts of who she was. "You stayed," she said. "You could have taken this weeks ago and gone. You stayed and you told me the truth when I asked for it, and you showed me this when I asked to see it. That matters to me." He stood up slowly. "Lenora," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded different than it had weight it had been gathering for 6 weeks. "We will deal with the agents first," she said, with the practical decisiveness of a woman who understood how to prioritize. "Everything else after." The conversation with the federal agents, a man named Forsyth and his colleague, an agent named Delacourt, took place the following morning in the back room of the Amber Rose, which was the most private space available in Caldwell Creek for a conversation of that nature. Lenora walked in beside Cornelius and sat down at the table with the same composure she brought to everything, and set the ledger down in front of Forsyth and said, "This belonged to my husband. I believe you have been looking for it." Forsyth, who had the look of a man who had been doing this work long enough to be surprised by very little, looked at the ledger and then at Lenora, and then at Cornelius with an expression that was several things at once. Cornelius said, "My name is in the ledger. The enforcement section. I worked for Crow on 3 specific occasions in 1879 and 1880. I want to clarify the nature of that work and the fact that I had no involvement in the crimes for which Crow was convicted." Forsyth opened the ledger. Delacourt took notes. The conversation that followed was long and careful, and sometimes uncomfortable and entirely honest, which Cornelius had discovered was both the hardest and the most efficient approach to conversations of this kind. What saved him in the end was 2 things. The first was the documentation section of the ledger, which contained information about Crow's operations that the federal investigation had not yet been able to confirm through other sources, and which Forsyth recognized immediately as valuable. The second was that the 3 occasions listed under Cornelius's name in the enforcement section could be corroborated as not involving the specific crimes under investigation, being instead collection activities relating to Crow's loan arrangements, which were their own category of unpleasant, but were not what Forsyth and Delacourt were there about. They could not give him a complete absolution. They were not empowered to do that, and Cornelius had not expected them to. What they could do and did do was document his cooperation and the value of the information he and Lenora had provided, and indicate that the federal investigation would not be pursuing him specifically in relation to Crow's primary charges, and that the enforcement activities listed under his name, while noted, were not of the severity that warranted further action given his cooperation. It was not a pardon. It was a line being drawn, carefully, with the understanding on all sides that he had stepped as close to it as a man in his position could come, and that what he did from this point forward would determine whether the line held. He walked out of the back room of the Amber Rose into the cold November air of Caldwell Creek and stood on the street for a moment with the light flat and gray overhead and the wind smelling of snow that had not arrived yet, and Lenora came out after him and stood beside him on the street. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. She looked up at the sky. He looked at her. "It might snow tonight," she said. "Might," he said. A pause in which the town moved around them on its ordinary business, and neither of them moved. "Come back and have coffee," she said. "It is cold out here." He followed her back to the boarding house, and they had coffee in the kitchen. And neither of them said the important things yet because neither of them was quite ready. And that was all right, because they were both people who understood that some things required the right moment to be spoken properly. The moment came 3 days later, when the first snow fell. It had been building for 2 days, the sky thickening and lowering, and the air carrying that particular quality of suspension that precedes a first snow. And on the morning of the 9th of November, Cornelius woke to white light through his east window, and the silence that is only produced by falling snow on open prairie, a silence so complete it has its own specific texture. He had been lying there listening to it when he heard her come out of her room across the hall, heard her footsteps on the stairs, heard the back door open, and then a quiet that told him she had stepped outside. He dressed and went downstairs and out the back door. She was standing in the kitchen garden, which was transformed, the bare herb stalks making small dark marks in the new white, and she was looking up at the sky with the snow falling on her face and her dark hair and her wool shawl pulled around her, and she looked like something from a painting that had not yet been painted, something that belonged to this specific place and this specific light. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he walked out into the snow and stood beside her. She looked over at him. Her face was cold and bright and open. "I love the first snow," she said. "I always have. Edmund thought I was strange for it. He preferred the summer." A pause. "I prefer the cold," Cornelius said. "Always have." She smiled at that. The real smile, the uncontained one. He turned to face her fully. "I need to tell you something," he said. She looked up at him. Snow was settling in her hair. "I know," she said. "I have been waiting for you to say it." "I am not a simple man," he said. "My history is complicated, and some of what I have done I am not proud of, and the life I have been living is not a life that looks like much from the outside. I do not have a home or prospects of the conventional kind, and I am 33 years old and have been moving since I was 18, and I am fully aware of all of that." She waited. "And I am in love with you," he said. "I have been in love with you since somewhere in October, and I did not know what to do with it, so I did nothing, which is arguably the coward's option, but I am doing something about it now." The snow fell between them and around them. She reached up with one hand and touched his jaw, her cold fingers against his cold face, and he stood very still. "You stayed," she said. "You came back when you left, and you stayed." That told me what I needed to know before the words did. He covered her hand with his. "I would like to keep staying," he said, "if you will let me." She looked at him with those gray eyes in the white light of the first snow and said, "I have been hoping you would say exactly that." He kissed her then, standing in the snow in the kitchen garden with the herbs buried in white, and the sky still coming down around them. And it was cold and warm at the same time, and it lasted long enough that they were both considerably snowier when it was over, which made her laugh, and her laugh made him smile, and both of those things together made something settle in Cornelius Redmond's chest that had not been settled since before the farm went under and he was 18 years old and went west. They went inside and she made breakfast and they ate it in the kitchen with the snow still falling outside the window, and Miss Park came down and said, "Oh, how lovely, the first snow," and Mrs. Beaumont said, "My bones knew it was coming." And Cornelius and Lenora looked at each other across the table and said nothing at all, and nothing at all was exactly sufficient. What followed was not simple. Nothing about rebuilding a life from complicated materials is simple, and both Lenora and Cornelius were people with enough intelligence to understand that love is a beginning and not a resolution, that it requires daily construction the way a house does, and that the materials they were working with included his dark past and her complicated grief and the history of Edmund Langston's hidden choices and the fundamental question of what two people who have been alone for a long time do when they decide to be something other than alone. But they were both people who understood work, and they were both people who understood honesty, having arrived at it somewhat expensively. And they were both, it turned out, people who were better with another person than they had known they could be. He stayed through the winter. He stayed not as a boarder, not as a guest passing through, but as something that did not have a simple administrative category in a boarding house ledger, but that everyone in Caldwell Creek understood within approximately 2 weeks of the first snow, because small towns in Kansas in 1882 were very good at understanding things that were visible to anyone paying attention. Martha Dewhurst at the general store said to Lenora in early December, "Well, I will say this, Mrs. Langston, he does not have the look of trouble any more." Lenora bought her coffee beans and smiled into her scarf. The Reverend Cully shook Cornelius's hand with both of his one Sunday after the service that Cornelius had begun attending, not from sudden religious feeling, but from the practical understanding that going to church with Lenora was a thing that made her happy, and that making Lenora happy had become something he was interested in doing consistently. The Reverend said, with his particular combination of kindness and accuracy, "I think you intend to stay, Mr. Redmond." "I do," Cornelius said. "Good," the Reverend said. "This town could use a man of your particular capacity, properly directed." Which was how Cornelius Redmond, at the suggestion of the Reverend Cully, and with the quiet backing of several town citizens who had observed his particular capacity over the preceding months, became the deputy sheriff of Caldwell Creek, appointed by the existing sheriff, a decent and perpetually overwhelmed man named Albright, who had been managing a town with 231 people, and a mill, and a saloon, and a seasonal influx of cattle drivers entirely by himself for 3 years. It was honest work. It was the right kind of work for a man who knew how violence operated and wanted to be on the side of preventing it rather than facilitating it. It required the skills he had and redirected them toward the thing he had been, underneath everything else, for his whole life. Someone who protected people when it was within his power to do so. He was good at it. Caldwell Creek, in the winter of 1882 and the spring and summer of 1883, had occasion to discover how good at it he was, in a series of situations that tested him, and that he navigated with the combination of experience and judgment that the job required. There was a dispute between 2 neighboring farms that came close to violence and was talked down. There was a man who came through in February, mean with whiskey and a bad history, who needed to be convinced very firmly that Caldwell Creek was not his kind of town, and Cornelius convinced him in the way he had learned from years of experience was most effective, directly, quietly, with total clarity about what would happen next if the convincing did not take. There was a fire at the mill in the spring, the mill that had been sold after Edmund's death and was now run by a family named Holt, that required the coordinated effort of half the town and everyone's bravest instincts, and Cornelius was in the middle of it, and came out of it with singed eyebrows and a deep burn on his left forearm that Lenora cleaned and bandaged with a focus and a fear that she let him see, which was the most direct evidence she had yet provided of how much she loved him. "You are not invincible," she said, wrapping his arm with clean cotton. "I am aware," he said. "I need you to continue to be aware of it," she said, and looked up at him with gray eyes that were currently the color of serious weather, and he said, "I will be very carefully aware of it," and she said, "See that you are," and finished the bandage and kissed his shoulder with a fierceness that was not entirely about the arm. They were married in June of 1883, in the church with the bell that had gotten its clapper replaced in April, a community effort organized by the Reverend Cully that had involved 3 carpenters, a blacksmith in Wichita who agreed to cast a new bell component, and the collective enthusiasm of a congregation that had been conducting services without a bell for 4 years and was ready to have one again. The bell rang on their wedding day, which felt appropriate, because a thing that had been missing being restored on a day about restoration had a rightness to it that even the most unromantic person in Caldwell Creek, who was probably the blacksmith Peterson, could appreciate. Lenora wore a dress she had made herself in the weeks before the wedding, blue-gray wool that matched the color her eyes went when she was happy. And she carried herbs from her kitchen garden, because it was June and they were flowering, and they smelled exactly like home. Cornelius wore his best coat and a new white shirt, and had combed his hair with a thoroughness that suggested genuine effort, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her come toward him, and felt something so large and complete and irreducible that he did not have a word for it, and had stopped needing one. He said his vows with the total steadiness of a man who meant them absolutely. She said hers with the particular Lenora quality of making a very serious thing sound both solemn and warm at once, which was the gift she had, and which had undone him from the beginning. The Reverend Cully married them with the satisfied expression of a man who has been hoping for this specific outcome since approximately October. The whole town came, all 231 of them plus 17 who had moved to the area since September, because Caldwell Creek understood collective occasions, and because Cornelius Redmond had, in the way of people who commit to a place fully, become part of the fabric of it. Mrs. Beaumont, who had finally made it to Wichita, and her daughter, and had come back because, she said, she preferred Caldwell Creek, brought a pie that was an act of culinary ambition and considerable skill. Miss Park, now Miss Park no longer but the recently married Mrs. Hooper, having married the surveyor who had come back to lay the railroad route and stayed, brought flowers and the very genuine happiness of a woman who likes to see other people as happy as she herself has recently become. Martha Dewhurst brought her husband and her opinions, all of which were positive. It was a good day. It was one of the very good days that do not happen often enough in a life, and that while they are happening, to mark and hold. The boarding house continued to operate, because Lenora had built it and would not give it up, and Cornelius did not ask her to, understanding that a woman's work and independence and the things she has made of herself are not inconveniences to be managed around but essential facts of who she is. He moved into the boarding house properly, his few belongings arranged alongside hers with a naturalness that surprised him, his notebook on the shelf next to her book of poems, his boots by the door next to her practical shoes, his presence in the kitchen in the mornings over coffee before the guests came down becoming one of the reliable rhythms of the days. He fixed things. He had not known he was good at fixing things because he had not had anything to fix in 15 years, but it turned out he was systematic and patient with mechanical problems, and that the boarding house had accumulated a list of them under the weight of Lenora managing everything alone. And working through that list over the weeks and months after the wedding gave him a particular satisfaction that he noted and filed alongside the other surprising discoveries of what it was to be settled in a place with a person you loved. He wrote to his mother in St. Louis. He had not written to her in 3 years, because the person he had been was not a person who found it easy to write to a mother who still hoped for things for him, but the person he was now had things to report that were worthy of her hopes, and he wrote her a letter that was 2 pages long, and told her about Lenora and the deputy work and the town and the bell on the church. And she wrote back within the month, a letter that was 4 pages, and involved a great deal of emotion expressed in the compressed, careful way of a woman who had learned to manage large feelings in small handwriting, and at the end of it she said she would very much like to come and visit, if they would have her. They wrote back immediately saying they would absolutely have her, and Magnolia Redmond arrived in Caldwell Creek in September of 1883. Exactly 1 year after her son had ridden in meaning to pass through, and she was a small woman with dark eyes like his and a warmth that was very much his in reverse, expressed outward where his was expressed inward, and she and Lenora took to each other within approximately 1 afternoon in a way that made Cornelius, watching them in the kitchen together, feel something that had a great deal to do with the idea of fullness. Magnolia stayed for 3 weeks. When she left, she extracted a promise from both of them to visit her in St. Louis before the end of the following year, and she kissed her son on the cheek in the way that reminded him he would always, to one person on earth, be someone's child, which was not a bad thing to be reminded of, and she held Lenora's hands and said, "You have given him back to himself. I can see it. Thank you." And Lenora looked startled and then moved in the way she was when something hit somewhere true. The year turned. 1883 became 1884, and Caldwell Creek grew by 43 people as the railroad route was confirmed, and the construction brought workers and workers brought families, and the town expanded in ways both practical and interesting. The general store got a second counter. The Amber Rose got a piano, which improved the evenings considerably. The school got 3 additional students, and Miss Park, who was now Mrs. Hooper and also expecting her first child, managed the expanding student body with the resourcefulness of a woman who had come from Ohio to the frontier and thrived on the challenge of it. Sheriff Albright decided in the spring of 1884 that he had done his time and wanted to retire and move to his daughters in Abilene, and the town held a proper election for his replacement, and Cornelius Redmond won it by a margin that suggested the vote had not been particularly close. He stood in the marshal's office, which had needed a new door since the previous October and now had one, courtesy of his own labor, and pinned the sheriff's badge to his coat and felt the weight of it in a way that was different from other weights he had carried. This one sat flat and even. This one was the right weight for a man who had decided, finally and completely, who he was going to be. He went home for lunch, which was a thing he was able to do because the marshal's office was 4 buildings from the boarding house, and Lenora was in the kitchen and looked at the badge when he came in and smiled the uncontained smile. "Sheriff Redmond," she said. "Mrs. Redmond," he said. She handed him a cup of coffee, and he sat down at the kitchen table, and they had lunch in the comfortable way of 2 people who have built something together and live inside it easily. That evening, she told him she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen after dinner, the same kitchen where he had eaten his first meal in Caldwell Creek 20 months ago, where the stew pot had been on the same hook, and the window had faced the same garden. And she told him with the directness and warmth that was entirely herself, watching his face as she said it, reading what it did to him. What it did to him was something he did not have prepared words for, which was fine because words were not required. He set his coffee cup down and looked at her, and she came around the table, and he held her there in the kitchen in the lamp light with the evening outside the window and the boarding house quiet around them, and he held her for a long time. "Are you all right?" she asked against his shoulder. "I am considerably better than all right," he said. "I am trying to find the word for it." "You can tell me when you find it," she said, not moving. "I may need some time," he said. "We have time," she said. "We have plenty of time." Their son was born in January of 1885, on a cold morning that would have been called a bad morning for many reasons, except that it was the morning he arrived, which made it impossible to call bad. He was healthy and loud, and had his mother's eyes and his father's disposition, which meant he was a person who looked at the world with both intensity and warmth, which Lenora observed on the 3rd day of his life and said, "He is going to be entirely impossible in the most wonderful way." They named him Edmund. Not because the name was uncomplicated, not because the man who had carried it before had been uncomplicated, but because complication was not the whole of a person, and because the ledger with Edmund Langston's name in it had also contained Edmund Langston trying at the end to do the right thing, and because Lenora had said she wanted to reclaim the name for something hopeful, and Cornelius had agreed, because she was nearly always right about the things that mattered. Edmund Cornelius Redmond was a fair and thriving baby who became a fair and energetic toddler, and was deeply interested in the boarding house cat, which had outlived all expectations and was now extremely elderly, and had developed a fondness for the warmest spot in the kitchen, and for small children who did not know how to pet cats correctly but who were warm and interesting. Magnolia Redmond came back from St. Louis in the spring of 1885 to meet her grandson, and stayed for 2 months, and was of enormous practical help and considerable emotional joy, and had strong opinions about baby management that she offered freely, and that Lenora received with the tolerance of a woman who was secure enough in her own judgment to let opinions exist in the air without adopting all of them. Cornelius and Lenora did make it to St. Louis in the fall of 1885, with Edmund, who was by then 9 months old and had opinions about train travel expressed mainly through volume. Magnolia's sister Clara was there, the one his mother had gone to live with after the farm, and Clara was the kind of woman whose warmth filled rooms and who greeted Lenora and her grandson with an enthusiasm that had no reservation in it whatsoever. And the visit was 4 days, and contained more family feeling than Cornelius had experienced since he was 17 years old. And he rode back to Kansas in the train with his wife asleep against his shoulder, and his son asleep in his arms, and the Missouri landscape going past the window in the dark, and he sat with all of it, the distance he had traveled, the way things end and begin, the very specific improbability of this particular life that was his, and he thought about riding into Caldwell Creek on that September Thursday meaning to pass through, and he thought about the kitchen garden and the green shutters and the gray eyes and the apple cake and the first snow. He thought about what it means to be a person who keeps moving because they cannot find anything worth stopping for, and what it means when they find it. He was 35 years old in that train in the dark, holding his sleeping son, his wife's head warm on his shoulder, and he was more entirely himself than he had ever been, more located, more real. And if that was what stopping felt like, then he was glad he had been persuaded to stop. He kissed the top of Lenora's head carefully so as not to wake her. She stirred anyway because she was a light sleeper and had been since Edmund's arrival. "Are you all right?" she asked, which was what she always asked, which he had come to understand was her way of saying I am here and I am paying attention. "Yes," he said. "I am thinking about September of 1882. She was quiet a moment. He could feel her smile, though he could not see it, her cheek moving against his shoulder. "When you rode in," she said. "When I meant to ride out," he said. "You were terrible at it," she said. He laughed quietly, careful of the sleeping child. "Yes," he said, "I was." She settled back against his shoulder. "I am very glad you were," she said. The train moved through the Missouri dark, heading back to Kansas, heading back to the town that had been a stop and had become a life, heading home. The spring of 1886 brought changes to Caldwell Creek that were both expected and unexpected. The railroad was fully operational now, and with it came a pace of commerce and population growth that required the sheriff's office to expand, and Cornelius hired 2 deputies, young men named Cole and Warwick, who were green but teachable, and who he trained with the patience of a man who understood that the skills he had were worth passing on to people who were going to use them correctly. Cole was 22, from a farm family in Iowa, earnest and strong and slower to anger than most people in his position, which Cornelius told him was an asset and meant it. Warwick was 24, sharper and quicker, but with a temper that needed managing, and Cornelius worked on that with the particular understanding of a man who had spent years managing his own. Both of them became, over time, good at what they did, and the combination of Cornelius's experience and their energy made Caldwell Creek a well-run town in a period when not all frontier towns could say the same. The boarding house remained one of the centers of the town's social life, not just because it housed travelers, but because Lenora had, over the years, made it a gathering place in the way that happens when someone with genuine warmth runs an establishment. People stopped in for coffee. The kitchen was often the venue for conversations that needed a warm, neutral space. The Reverend Cully kept his weekly visit with a loyalty that had outlasted his advancing age, and the fact that he now moved more slowly and needed assistance on icy mornings. He was in the kitchen one December morning in 1886, nearly 80 years old and drinking his coffee with the pleasure of a man who has found one of life's reliable good things, when he looked at Lenora and at the very obvious evidence of her second pregnancy, and said, with the satisfaction of a man who keeps an accurate ledger of blessings, "The town is growing in every sense." Lenora said, "We are hoping for a girl this time," and she looked across the kitchen at Cornelius, who was at the table with a report, and looked up when she said it with the slight smile that was his particular variety of happiness. Their daughter arrived in March of 1887. They named her Rose because Lenora wanted the name, and because Cornelius had learned, convincingly, that there are very few good reasons to argue with Lenora about names and several good reasons not to. Rose was born with her father's dark hair and her mother's gray eyes, and a disposition that was her own entirely, which became clear within her first months as the disposition of a person who finds the world deeply interesting and intends to examine all of it closely. Edmund, who was 2 years old when Rose arrived and had strong opinions about most things, had strong opinions about Rose primarily in the direction of approval, which Lenora had hoped for and Cornelius had also privately hoped for, because the alternative would have been manageable but loud. The years settled into themselves with the particular rhythm of a life that is genuinely well lived, not without difficulty, because difficulty does not require invitation, and life in frontier Kansas in the late 1880s presented its share of it, but with the underlying stability of two people who had chosen each other clearly and built something real together. There were hard winters and dry summers. There was a dispute with a cattle company that came through in 1887, wanting to use a route through Caldwell Creek's farmland that the farmers did not want used, and Cornelius spent 3 weeks mediating between parties who had, at the start, been very far apart, and who ended up at a compromise that pleased no one entirely and everyone adequately, which was sometimes the best available outcome. There was illness in the town in 1888, not the epidemic kind but the gradual, wearing kind of a rough winter on a community, and Lenora organized, with the practical efficiency she applied to everything, a system of food sharing and checking in among the town's elderly and most vulnerable residents that Cornelius watched operate with a steady pride that had no performance in it. There were good summers, too. There were harvests that came in well and celebrations at the mill, which the Holt family had rebuilt after the fire and run with the kind of investment in the community that Edmund Langston, in his better nature, might have aspired to. There were summer evenings on the boarding house porch when the whole day cooled into golden light and Edmund and Rose ran in the kitchen garden, and the cat, who had finally passed the previous winter at an age that the town's veterinarian described as remarkable, was replaced by a dog named Captain who had been a stray and had made the practical decision to stay, which Cornelius respected on principle. The Reverend Cully passed away in the summer of 1889, peacefully, having spent his last year moving more slowly but thinking no less clearly, and his memorial was attended by everyone in the town and was conducted by the new minister, a younger man from Arkansas named Reverend Green, who had the Reverend Cully's genuine kindness, if not yet his decades of accumulated wisdom, which was a thing that could only be gained through decades. Cornelius and Lenora sat in the front pew, and Cornelius thought about the old man asking him what he did for a living and accepting resting as a complete answer, and he thought that was probably the most charitable act of acceptance anyone had extended to him in his whole life, and he was grateful for it. Edmund Cornelius Redmond grew into a boy who was curious and somewhat stubborn, and good at most things he put his mind to, which included an early facility with numbers that manifested as an obsessive interest in Cornelius's logbooks from the sheriff's office, which he was allowed to look at under supervision, and which he treated with a reverence that was both touching and faintly alarming. He was also, from about age 5, deeply interested in the horses in the town livery, and spent a considerable amount of time there, and the livery owner, a patient man named Garcia, taught him to care for horses with a thoroughness that would have pleased anyone who valued the relationship between a person and an animal that carries them. Rose Redmond was 3 years younger and entirely her own person, which was immediately apparent and became more apparent with time. She was the one who asked questions that required sitting down to answer properly. She was the one who made friends with every dog and cat, and occasionally bird that came within her reach. She was the one who, at age 4, solemnly informed the new minister during a Sunday coffee that she intended to be a doctor when she was grown, and who at age 6 showed every sign of meaning it, which Lenora encouraged with the total conviction of a woman who understood that a girl's intentions about her own future were not for other people to redirect. Cornelius, when people expressed surprise at this conviction about Rose's future, said, with the calm authority of the town sheriff, "She has said she intends to be a doctor. I have no reason to doubt her," which tended to end the conversation. In the fall of 1889, 7 years after Cornelius had ridden into Caldwell Creek on that September Thursday, he and Lenora stood on the porch of the boarding house in the October evening light, and Edmund was inside doing the arithmetic homework that his school teacher, the latest in a series since Mrs. Hooper had retired to focus on her own 3 children, assigned with enthusiasm. And Rose was asleep upstairs, having worn herself out with a thorough investigation of the kitchen garden's fall state, and the prairie was its autumn self in every direction, the grass gone gold and the cottonwoods along the creek yellow bright against the blue sky. Lenora leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and they stood like that for a while, watching the evening come in. "I was thinking," she said, about the ledger," she said, "about Edmund, about all of it." He waited. "I think he would have done the right thing," she said, "if he had lived. I think the documentation was the beginning of it. I think he was going to find his way to the right thing." "I think so too," Cornelius said. She was quiet for a moment. "I am glad we gave his name to our son," she said. "I am glad we did not let the complicated parts be the whole of it." He kissed the top of her head. "You have a gift," he said, "for finding what is worth keeping." She looked up at him with gray eyes in the October light, and she said, "Well, I kept you, didn't I?" He pulled her in and held her there against the evening, and the town was doing its evening things around them. Captain the dog investigating something at the fence, the light in the amber rose going warm and yellow, the distant sound of someone's piano, the smell of autumn and cook fires, and the prairie getting ready for another winter. He had ridden in 7 years ago, meaning to pass through. The first snow would come in a few weeks, and when it did they would be inside together in the warm kitchen with the children and the dog and the fire, and he would remember the snow on her face the morning he told her the truth of what he felt, and she would probably remember it too, because she remembered everything, being the kind of person who pays attention and holds what is worth holding. He was not passing through anymore. He was home in every sense that the word has ever carried, the physical and the human and the essential, the sense that encompasses the specific kitchen and the specific light through the east window and the specific weight of the person you love when they are close, and the sense that encompasses what you are when you are with someone who has seen you completely and chosen to stay. Home. He had ridden west at 18 looking for something he could not name and had found, at 33, in a Kansas town with green shutters and a kitchen garden, and a woman with gray eyes who made excellent stew, and had a real laugh and the total courage of a person who looks at complicated truth and decides to work with it rather than around it. He was home. The October light fell on the boarding house porch and on the street of Caldwell Creek and on the prairie in every direction, and Lenora Langston Redmond stood beside him, and the evening came in, and it was good. It was genuinely and sustainably and entirely good, which is the only kind of good that matters. Inside, Edmund called something from the kitchen that might have been a question about arithmetic or might have been a request for something to eat. It was difficult to tell, and Lenora straightened up and said, "That child," with the tone that was fond and exasperated and deeply loving all at once. "Go," Cornelius said. "I will bring in the wood." She went inside, and he stepped off the porch and went to the woodpile, and he split what was needed and stacked it in his arms, and he looked up at the sky that was the deep blue of an October evening trending toward the dark, and one star was visible already, the first of the evening, and the air was cold and clean and smelled like the winter coming. He carried the wood inside. The door closed behind him. The lamplight came through the windows of the boarding house of Lenora Langston Redmond, warm and steady in the October dark, and Caldwell Creek went about its evening, and the prairie was very quiet, and in 7 years a man who had ridden in meaning to pass through had put down roots deep enough that they would hold through any winter, through many winters, through all of it, through the whole long good life ahead of them that neither of them had planned and both of them had built, one honest day at a time.